Hello everyone, this is Eisenherz and I'm finally back with another video. Today we're going to talk about one of the new cards that was spoiled for Modern Horizons 3, Winter Moon. This 2 CMC artifact reads, players can't untap more than one non-basic land every turn. This seems great for 1 to 2 color decks to hate on 3 to 5 color decks, right? Well, not so fast. Let's compare this to some existing cards to assess whether or not this is actually playable or noob bait. So if you break it down a little bit, Winter Moon basically says every player can untap one non-basic land and all of their basic lands every turn, which is why it kind of seems asymmetrical for lower colored decks against higher colored decks. A similar but much stronger mana denial effect would be Back to Basics, because Back to Basics basically says every player can untap none of their non-basic lands and all of their basic lands every turn, which makes it kind of asymmetrical for lower colored decks against higher colored decks as well, if you build your land base accordingly. Another similar effect that I'm very familiar with would be Winter Orb, because if you play it in Urza, this card basically says every player, except you, can untap only one land every turn. So we have a new card that is similar to already existing cards. Now let's compare some important axes of these cards to see how good the new one actually is. For this we will assume that the cards are being played in 1 to 2 color decks against 4 to 5 color decks. Let's look at the casting cost first. Winter Orb and Winter Moon cost only 2 colorless mana, which makes them very easy to cast. Back to Basics, however, cost a total of 3 mana, one of which has to be blue, which makes it slightly harder to cast and also only playable in blue decks. Now let's look at the card's availability. Winter Orb and Winter Moon are artifacts, which makes them much easier to tutor for in lower colored decks. Back to Basics being an enchantment makes it very hard to tutor for, and most cards that tutor for Back to Basics, like Enlightened Tutor, can also grab Winter Orb or Winter Moon. Finally, let's look at the most important axis, and that will be potency, so the overall impact these cards have on the game. Back to Basics is by far the strongest here. It lets your opponents only untap basic lands, which literally shuts off most 4 to 5 color decks' land base after one use. Winter Moon is still strong, but definitely weaker than Back to Basics, because it still allows your opponents to untap one non-basic land every turn, which makes a huge difference. Winter Orb is in a weird spot. Its stacks effect itself is way stronger than Winter Moon, because it targets both non-basic and basic lands, but its effect is only asymmetrical in certain decks, like in Urza. So what's the conclusion for Winter Moon? In lower color decks that can't play Back to Basics, can't use Winter Orb asymmetrically and still want some kind of mana denial against higher color decks, Winter Moon is definitely an option. It's cheap, easy to tutor for, and although it's not nearly as potent as Back to Basics, it can certainly deny some mana. But, and that's a huge bubble but, in my experience you shouldn't be on any of these cards currently. The impact mana denial through Landhate has in cEDH is so minimal that none of these cards pull enough weight anymore. There is a reason why Landhate specifically gets so much hate from casual EDH players, but is basically a non-issue in cEDH. While casual EDH decks heavily rely on land-based ramp, lands just aren't as important in cEDH. Mana rocks and rituals carry most cEDH decks through their turns, because when a game lasts for only 3 to 7 turns and you are only playing around 27 lands and you can only play 1 land per turn anyway, having someone stop some of your lands from producing mana is annoying but not backbreaking. The biggest powerhouse among the Landhate pieces is in early Back to Basics, before anyone can deploy too many rocks, especially paired with additional mana hate such as Trinisphere or Khan the Great Creator. But on its own, a mid to late game Winter Orb or Winter Moon will not be impactful enough, because lots of decks just function incredibly well with only one land untap per turn and potentially even a land drop. So to make it more clear, let's just break it down turn by turn. On turn 1, everyone will most likely only have one land in play unless there is a pre-game Gemstone Caverns. This means that Winter Orb and Winter Moon literally do nothing. However, a turn 1 Back to Basics turns most lands into straight up one-time use rituals. On turn 2, everyone will most likely have 2 lands in play, which means that Winter Orb and Winter Moon affect only 50% of the land base. If we add early ramp into this equation, like all the mana positive rocks that see play in cEDH, this kind of mana denial only hurts slightly. Now, on turn 3, everyone will most likely have 3 lands in play, which means that Winter Orb and Winter Moon affect 66% of the land base. If we now add early mana rocks and the fact that people can play around Winter Orb and Winter Moon by primarily using their rocks for mana, the potency of these cards is reduced a lot. Now, Back to Basics again takes the top spot in terms of potency here, but it also suffers from the fact that rocks and rituals dominate the format in terms of mana production, so even Back to Basics won't be as impactful as you might think. So effects like Winter Orb and Winter Moon get more potent over the course of the game, but only really pull their weight if there is another layer of mana denial such as Karn the Great Creator or Trinisphere, which forces your opponents to either use their lands for mana or spend way more mana to develop than they would usually have to. In conclusion, I think Winter Moon, just like other similar land mana denial effects, are mostly bait, because they don't impact the game axis of resource battle as much as you'd want them to. If you want to go for that route, additional hate pieces are absolutely necessary to create a lock through which your opponents will be significantly affected. Landhate on its own will just not suffice in a format that's incredibly fast, plays a ton of mana rocks and rituals, minimal amount of lands, mostly very cheap spells, combos that can win the game for as little as 3 mana, and in which games are usually limited to 80 minutes for 4 players. And that's it. So what do you think about this new card? Leave a comment down below. Thank you for watching my videos. Make sure to like, share, comment and subscribe. This is Eisenherz and auf Wiedersehen.